Hello, viewers and learners of the Postgraduate Diploma in Environmental and Occupational Health and Master of Arts in Environmental and Occupational Health. Welcome to this session. Today we will discuss on the topic droughts. This forms a part of the course MEV 002 Environmental and Occupational Hazards. Along with me, we have in our studio with us Professor R. Bhaskar. Welcome to the studio from the School of Sciences and the discipline of Geology. Now, since 1900, more than 11 million people have suffered and have died and have been affected by the droughts. So droughts can have drastic and long-term effects on the vegetation, on the ecology of a region. They can have environmental impacts on the human health, and it can also lead to famine. Now, these are the second costliest extreme events after the hurricanes. Unlike other extreme events, like for example, they could be the tornadoes or the thunderstorms or even the hurricanes, but it is very difficult to pinpoint the exact start of a drought and when it is actually ended. So the longer the drought lasts, the greater will be the impacts on the people and also on the environment. To learn more about the droughts, Professor Bhaskar, can you explain to our viewers the definition of a drought?
If you ask definition of drought, that means there is for a certain period of time, there is less precipitation than the average. When this keeps on occurring, it results in drought. Drought is an hazard which is a slow kind of hazard. It's a slow onset hazard, and this is not a rapid one like earthquake or tsunami, and it can occur for months or years together. As Dr. Sushmita mentioned, we really don't know exactly when it starts, and in real sense, we don't know when it ends. What we see is that the rainfall keeps on decreasing. There are different stages of drought, and there are several causes. Of course, these are natural phenomena also, but human activities can also accelerate the impacts of the droughts. When does drought occur? The definition is when there is a noticeable deficit in water supply or rains for extended periods, a drought occurs. This extended period may be days, may be weeks, may be months. In some cases, it can be decades. We have had history in which for more than a decade, there was drought. If you see in parts of Africa, you had the drought and there was mass migration, starvation, cattle dying, all these things. Of course, these are accelerated by even the war-like conditions, and this also results in disturbance in the society. We lost around 680,000 lives in Africa because of the droughts in 83 and 84. So you can see how much death is there. As Dr. Sushmita mentioned, this is the second kind of hazard in terms of the economic loss. And let me tell you, learners, that this droughts is going to affect the achieving of all the sustainable development goals, because the bedrock of sustainable development goals is to remove poverty. And droughts affect the agriculture, and this affects the food security. So we will be derailed in all the achieving sustainable development goals if we do not take care. Now, the second aspect you should know is that since 2000, 29% there has been increase in the amount of droughts compared to the past 2 decades. Already 2.3 billion people do not have access to water. If you see the UNICEF report, by 2040, 1 in 4 child will be having water stress. So what you can see is that drought is not a simple mechanism of just drying up. Also, what you are seeing is that this will cause loss to the environment, and sometimes you can have this zoonotic diseases, pathogens which can cross once the barriers are broken. Because environment is damaged, the barriers are broken, and then you can have the spread, the jump from animal to human kind of diseases. So this is quite complex. So when do we term a region to be drought affected? A region is termed drought affected when it receives consistent below average precipitation. So we have more rain in a particular place, flood. Less rain, it can be drought. It can be normal compared to the average statistics, or it can be below normal or scanty. So these are the classifications which are given. There are several stages of drought. The droughts are divided into 3 critical stages before their ultimate manifestation. Now, the first one is the meteorological drought. Now, this is because the precipitation is less in a given area, and this precedes all kind of drought. Now this, if you understand the water cycle, if you understand the connections between hydrosphere, atmosphere, biosphere and lithosphere, what you will see when the rainfall is less, obviously you will see the soil moisture will be less, obviously you will see the water accumulating in the reservoirs will be less, and this is a chain of events. So the first one is the meteorological drought, the second one is the agricultural drought. Now what is agricultural drought? Crop production is affected. Why this occurs? Because there is no water, the soil moisture gets dried up, and water is so much less that plants cannot survive and livestock cannot survive. So this results in agricultural drought. The next stage is the hydrological drought. Now that means the water in the reservoirs, lakes and other areas are below the statistical averages. Now why does this occur? This occurs because consistently the rainfall keeps on decreasing. Alternatively, it can be a question of supply and demand. If we keep on taking more water than the rainfall, it is replenished, then you can have the droughts. There are other two kinds of droughts also which are mentioned in the literature. One is the socio-economic drought. Socio-economic drought is again related to supply of certain items related to water scarcity. For example, in Uruguay, what happened that the energy production was dependent on the flowing stream or flowing water. So when the flowing water is not there, then the energy production stops, and this can be for fish or other activities also. This is called socio-economic drought. There is another kind of drought which is called ecological drought. Ecological drought means the drought conditions are so much that the ecosystems are stressed, and these can have multiple effects. In nature, the hydrosphere, atmosphere, biosphere, lithosphere, pedosphere, all are related, and drought affects because of the events which are interconnected with each other. Now, if you see the Indian agriculture also, if you see in case of hydrological drought, is dependent on the monsoons. If there is a poor monsoon, then you have the possibility of drought. If there is a very good more rain, you can have floods. Normally, you must have seen reports of droughts occurring in Rajasthan, in parts of Gujarat, in parts of Andhra Pradesh, some parts of Karnataka and Odisha, etc. So these are related to the monsoon events. Then developing countries face higher risk than the developed countries. It is not that developed countries do not face the risk. For example, Australia also faces drought. Even US in certain places like California also, they had drought like conditions. So drought has no geographical boundaries. It can occur anywhere. The condition is that if we take more than what is replenished by nature, then it results in drought. Then it can lead to several social issues like food insecurity, famine, etc. And this can lead to mass migrations, and these have happened in the past. Now the next one, what are the natural causes? Causes can be natural, they can also be man-made. If you see the natural causes, it is because of the weather patterns, because weather contains the amount of moisture, heat in the air, land and sea. The distribution of this determines whether there will be a drought or not. Now if you see oceans, 70% of the surface of the earth is made up of oceans, and oceans control the weather circulation patterns. And it is very important that ocean temperatures have to be understood. Climate change is a very serious issue. If we do not act, then this will lead to mass kind of extinctions. Already we are seeing a lot of biodiversity being lost in these things. Small temperature fluctuations in oceans can cause ripple effect in the atmospheric systems. Now, what you are seeing in the North Pacific and Atlantic Ocean, the temperature, that has effect on the weather climate on the land. Similarly, El Nino and La Nina again are related to these kind of situations where the temperature fluctuations are there. Now, how it will be affected? If you see, it will be dependent on how air circulates through the atmosphere. This is very important. It depends on high pressure region or low pressure region, and whether clouds are formed or not. All these are the factors which determine this. When land is dry, it adds more to drought conditions. Why? Because if the heat is there, whatever little moisture is there escapes, it becomes drier, and that is not sufficient to form cloud. So you can see this will progress further, and we have to be alert that these kind of situations, wherever possible, we can reduce them. What are the man-made causes? Of course, climate change is one of the important issues. As I said, this is one of the man-made causes, because climate change, they cause erratic rainfalls and erratic conditions where the rainfall occurs excessively or very scantily, and they also occur untimely. Earlier we had a fixed pattern, but now we don't know where it rains. You are seeing in places like Rajasthan, if you have seen, reports of floods are there, which was never thought about. So all these are result of climate change, and drought-like conditions are created in many places. Then excess water demand. Suppose there is more water demand due to urbanization, due to the kind of agricultural practices what we do, and put intensive stress on water requirement, then this can again result in these kind of conditions, drought-like conditions. Similarly, if we draw excess water from the hydroelectric dams, what can happen is that the downstream areas can get depleted. Another important thing we have to remember is deforestation. It is related to how the water is captured by the plant and the soil is kept in place and the moisture is there. So if you do the deforestation, you are in a way going to encourage the occurrence of droughts. With this, now request Dr. Sushmita Bhaskar to explain what could be the impacts of the droughts.
So now we come on to the impacts and the consequences that droughts can have on the environment and on the human beings. So droughts can cause significant damage to the local economy, and they can also lead to secondary effects like famine. It also can damage an entire ecosystem and also the agricultural productivity. So when the agricultural sector is entirely affected, there will be no crops. The crops, because the land becomes barren, it becomes dry. So there will be no soil fertility, and then again there will be problem for the decreased carrying capacity for the livestock. So there again you find that there is no vegetation, and then the people are not having the food in order to grow. That is, the crops are not growing, the food is not being produced, and that leads to some kind of malnutrition, and people are forced to migrate from one region to another. They significantly impact the environmental, the agricultural, the human health, and the socio-economy of a region, and this definitely varies according to the vulnerability. Now, the water quantity and the water quality can also be reduced because of the low water flows. If there is any pollutant or any pollution that is going on over there, so that will not be getting diluted properly. So hence you can see that the water supplies also get contaminated due to the result of the drought. So the water pollution and the quality of the water is reduced when there is a drought which is occurring. Health effects. So in this picture, if you see, there is a boy, he is sitting, and you find that he is completely emaciated, and his ribs and the bones are seen. So this is a form of protein deficiency, and it is known as kwashiorkor. So in many of the drought affected regions, we find kwashiorkor, and the people are also having the other forms of malnutrition, dehydration, then they have mental illnesses, anxiety, depression, then waterborne illnesses, and also the vector-borne diseases like ticks, which are transmitted by the ticks or the mosquitoes, the African sleeping sickness, then the Chagas disease, the Kala Azar. There are so many vector-borne diseases, and especially you can find them which are totally in certain continents alone. So this kwashiorkor, this is also referred to as an edematous malnutrition because of the fluid retention in the body. Especially if you see the person, the entire body will be emaciated, but there will be a fluid retention or accumulation of the fluid, especially in the belly, that is in the abdomen, in the feet, and also in the ankle. So these are some of the health effects that have been observed by scientists. The famine in Ethiopia, this which occurred from 1983 to 85, here there were prevalences of kwashiorkor as well as marasmus. Marasmus is also another severe condition. It is a malnutrition which is characterized by energy deficiency. Coming on to the ecological effects. So often you would have traveled to desert and the desertification where that has taken place. So here you would have seen that the ecology is completely different over there. But when we are talking about droughts, the soil is compacted. You find that the ground is dry, there are cracks. So the entire vegetation can be lost. And wildfires can also erupt over there. And this can completely erode the landscapes. So dust storms can also occur, and this dust storms can also transmit certain infectious diseases from one person to another. It will also result in decreased crop growth and also a decreased carrying capacity for the livestock. Now this photo, if you see, this is that of the dying trees which are observed at Griffith Park in Los Angeles in California. So this occurred when there was a drought-like condition and wildfires erupted. Like this, entire ecosystems can be damaged, like the pine forest near the Los Alamos in New Mexico. So this was completely devastated. In 2002, the pine trees, they started losing their evergreen foliage, and 2 years later, even they lost all the needles. So that is the impact that drought can have, and the plants start dying at a very fast rate. Certain plants, like for example even the desert plants, they have adapted themselves to suit these needs. So they are able to grow even without the water. Some examples are the yuccas, the cacti, and some of the mosses. So yuccas have the deep root systems, that is their roots are so well developed that they can go in search of the water systems. The cacti have spiny and the hairy spines and also spikes that will limit the water for loss to evaporation. In the same way, mosses can also withstand a high amount of the complete dehydration. This pictures that you see, that is of the yuccas in the Pine Creek in Creek Canyon. What are the environmental impacts that have been observed? So here in this figure, you can see the pine tree, the ponderosa pine, and also the Douglas fir trees. In 2011, this Las Conchas fire which occurred in the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico, this was completely devastated by the wildfires. So the wildfires have devastated many of the vegetations and the animals' habitats, and the mangroves also have been devastated. So the mangroves, let me tell you, they are the protection. They offer protection for the coastlines, for the shorelines, and they prevent from soil erosion and so on. So they prevent the communities that are staying there also. But the largest recorded mangrove dieback also occurred in Australia when they suffered from the droughts. Drought can also create significant socio-economic impacts and problems, and for example, low water for irrigation. So this will affect the food productivity, and then people are forced to import their food from other countries. In the same way, there will be mass migration of people from one region to another. So there is a form of internal displacement. Then there is shortage of water for the industrial users, and small disputes or even the disputes that occur over the natural resources, that also occurs, and these are some of the socio-economic problems and social unrest which is observed. The human impacts, of course, crop failure and the failure to produce the food that is required for the livelihoods for the people, for their sustenance, and with the fewer crops and the water restrictions also being enforced, then we definitely have some form of a food crisis. There have been some historical droughts, that is a northern Chinese famine which occurred from 1876 to 1879. This was led by the drought-induced crop failures which began in 1875, and millions, like 9.5 to 13 million people died in China as a result of this drought. The Dust Bowl, this was again another significant severe dust form which greatly damaged the ecology and agriculture of the American and the Canadian prairies in the 1930s. Here again, this drove 2 million people off the land, and several infectious diseases, including the fungal disease that is known as the valley fever. Then the dust also carried measles and influenza and transmitted them from one person to another. So the Dust Bowl also served as a form of an infectious disease transmission. Now in India also, the drought has been occurring and it has resulted in 10 and millions of deaths right from the 18th, 19th and the 20th centuries. So the 18 meteorological and 16 hydrological droughts have occurred in India in the time span between 1870 to 2018. The Indian agriculture is heavily dependent on the country's climate, which is a favorable monsoon also, in order to get the water for irrigating India's crops. In the same way, we have had other droughts also, like those which occurred in Australia. The responses to the drought was that the state and the territory governments, they signed the National Drought Agreement to find ways in order to help the farmers combat the drought conditions and recover from the same. And they invested in the desalination plants, which could actually convert the seawater, the saline seawater, into safe drinking water. Then Perth, a city which is on the west coast, that is pumping 10% of its treated wastewater underground, and the rocks that are beneath the ground, they naturally filter and store the water so that it can be used again. Also, they saved water by using the aerated devices like the aerated taps, the shower heads, used recycled water, and they also collected the rainwater in order to water their gardens and also to wash their cars. So these are some energy efficient technologies. Now coming on to some technologies, urban water conservation and efficiency. So we have to be mindful about the amount of water that we use every day and adopting the landscape designs and the type of the plants. For example, drought tolerant plants can be used and also attending to some leaking taps and pipes. Water recycling can be processed in the several sectors. Agricultural water conservation. Now here the crop rotation, then the no-till farming for minimal soil disturbance, and also the cover crops can be used for the agriculture. And the world's crops, they are going to require trillion cubic meters of water, for agriculture and cultivation of the crops. And if you see, rice is being grown in many of the countries. It is a staple diet of the people. So scientists are now going on for the climate resilient varieties and the drought resistant staple food and the rice which can be grown by using very little water. Otherwise, rice is actually, it has got an extraordinary thirst for water. The UN Convention to Combat Desertification in 2006 was an international treaty that aims to promote the effective action through innovative and local programs and international partnerships, and more than 1 billion will have little access to water by 2030, and the demand will also increase further. This can also displace 700 million people by 2030. Therefore, land degrading practices should be discouraged and we should go on for sustainable practices. Finally, combating desertification and drought is very important. The General Assembly adopted the Convention to combat the desertification, linking environment and the sustainable development goals to sustainable land management on the 17th of June. And it is observed on 17th of June annually. And it is normally, we conduct some programs in order to conduct certain awareness, create awareness on land degradation, restoring the soil productivity, and also address the drought mitigation. So my dear viewers and learners, today we discussed about droughts, the causes of the droughts and the impacts and the consequences that droughts can have, explaining the same with the help of a few case studies and that which have occurred in the history. I hope you have had a good understanding of the same. Thank you for your patient listening. Thank you.